Hello, my name is Ethan Aldridge. I'm an author and illustrator, and today I wanted to give you a look at the process for making the cover of my new Gothic horror novel, DEEPHAVEN. So when I'm making a cover like this that has a lot of ornate architectural elements and character work, I spend a lot of time just working on the pencils and making sure that I have the bare bones of the thing put together correctly. You can see here that I've used a ruler to measure out the sort of basic outline of what's going to be the architectural elements of the house that sort of frame the entire composition of the cover, as well as doing the rough line work for the character elements. Right here I'm drawing the beast, which is sort of this mysterious entity that stalks the halls and kind of overshadows the vast majority of the narrative of the novel. I wanted the beast to be this kind of strange, ethereal figure sort of looming over the more rigid architecture of the house itself, as a kind of a nice visual contrast. And of course, centered in the middle of the composition, sort of enclosed and surrounded in a very threatening way by the house, is Guinevere Tallow, or Neve. Neve is the protagonist of the story. They are a young student who comes to DEEPHAVEN Academy and sort of finds themselves playing the begrudging role of a sort of supernatural investigator. And so just like with the beast and with the house, you can see I'm sort of roughing in the general overall shape. I try to focus a lot, particularly on the characters, because the characters is the thing that the viewer is going to focus on the most. And so I try at the very start to focus on getting the overall shape and proportions correct so that it reads smoothly, that it's very clear just at a glance what the viewer is looking at. Once I have the overall shape down, I go in and I add details. You can see I'm at this stage fairly confident, but you can see, like, when I'm doing the construction parts, there's a lot of kind of sketchy search lines, but when I'm doing details like this, you can see that I'm actually pretty confident, and this is because I've drawn Neve quite a few times by now, over the course of a couple years, just in my sketchbooks of trying to, as a way to kind of get to know them better, the visuals of them and how they move, and then of course for the illustrations of the book itself. So once I've done that, you can see that I bust out my dip pens. Most of my final artwork is done with dip pen and inkwell. In this case, I'm using an FW acrylic artist ink. I like this ink because it draws quite smooth, and once dry, it's waterproof. And so I kind of carefully go through every element of the drawing and ink over the pencil lines. You'll see a little bit later on, but once everything is inked, I'll go back with a soft kneaded eraser and erase all the pencil lines out from under the ink drawing, leaving just the clean black lines of the ink. For very fine detail, high focus areas like Neve's face here, I'm using a very fine nib crow quill dip pen. They can do very fine detail. It has a very sharp point. Not a whole lot of flex to the nib. It's really just for doing these very exact detail kind of work. And once I'm done with that, I'll switch to a G-nib, which is my kind of go-to dip pen. G-nibs have a lot more flexibility, which means that depending on how much pressure you exert on the pen, the line can go from thin to thick really fluidly and easily, and it makes a lot more lively line. It can help give a picture more depth and a little more life to it. You can see that it flows very smoothly as well. And so I basically just go through the whole drawing this way. I ink over the basic line work of everything, especially once I'm out of the really tiny, fine detail work. I try to focus on making big, confident strokes. I want a really nice, fluid, lyrical line, especially when it comes to the beast, because like I said, they're sort of acting as a visual contrast to the more rigid elements of the architecture of the house. And so I kind of almost use it at like brush strokes. And in some of the hairs, I don't think you see it in this video, I actually do use a brush just to really get that nice sort of ethereal fluid quality to the hair of the beast. And I go through the whole drawing this way. It takes a while. This is kind of a very enjoyable part of the process, but can be a little bit stressful because this is the part of the process that the capacity for messing up, I find, is greatest. You know, I'll misdraw a line, or an ink blob will occur, or things like that. It doesn't happen very often. I'm usually pretty good with control for the pen, but it does sometimes happen. So once the characters are completed, I move on to the architectural elements. The reason I start with the characters first is because, like I said, that's where the audience, that's where their eye tends to go first and foremost. And so I want to make sure that the drawing for them is good and tight and finished before moving on to anything else, because if I mess up the drawing of the characters, then the whole thing has to get started over. Whereas if I mess up on a detail of the architecture, if it's a small goof, it is something I could sort of correct digitally if I have to. But once I go through all the architectural elements, then I go in and I erase the lines, like I said, and I begin adding textures. This is one of my favorite parts because even though it looks kind of tedious, you can see it's just a lot of little teeny lines and hatching. It's where all the texture and depth comes into the picture for me. And because it's so repetitive, it actually can get pretty meditative. I love just putting on an audiobook and a podcast and just sort of turning my brain off and just doing these really high detail hatch lines. Finally, for the ink work, I switched to colored inks for light sources. In this case, there are two light sources on the cover. There's the beast's kind of gleaming eyes and the candle that Nev is holding. Using colored inks was a trick I discovered in my last graphic novel, The Legend of Brightblade, where it helps to make those things look more luminous. It kind of really gives them a pop. Finally, I switched to a wider nib. This one's technically for calligraphy. I'm afraid I don't know what size it is. It's just kind of in my little box of ink nibs. But it's a much thicker, rougher line, so I can fill in these bigger areas that require a lot of hatching, but still move fairly quickly. And the kind of roughness of the nib helps give it that kind of ragged, very noticeably hand-drawn look. Preserving that hand-drawn look is partially why I am drawing this as small as I am, because if I were to draw this at a larger size and then it was shrunk down for print for the cover, it would look very smooth and clean, which is great, but I want this to be a really noticeably hand-drawn cover. Once I get to this stage of it, you can see I'm using a sort of fine tip hard brush to fill in the spot blacks. I don't want it to be too brush-like because I want it to match the scratchiness of the nib drawing. So it's kind of it's a brush tip that's hardened over time. I use it a lot for this kind of ink work because it's basically just kind of a rough pen nib itself at this point, so that I can meld it really seamlessly with the hatched line work. Once the line work is done, I move on to watercolor paint. I mostly use Holbein watercolors. They have a really nice selection of colors, and they tend to stay pretty vivid as you paint on. I'm keeping the colors for this cover fairly simple. The illustrations on the interior of the book are obviously black and white, and the whole thing kind of has a German expressionist silent horror film vibe to it, and I wanted to retain that for the cover. Though publishers prefer color covers because obviously that's a little more eye-catching on a shelf. So I decided to keep it to very simple color scheme. There's basically only two colors on the cover. There's the yellows and the kind of strange tealy green color. With watercolor, you want to start with the warmest, lightest colors and move to your darkest and coolest. It's just the way the paint works, the very translucent paint. It's just easier to shift things that way. So I obviously start with the warm colors of Nev and their candle, and then switch to the sort of odd greens of the background and the beast. And once the sort of overall color washes are done, I go in with various shades of grays and blacks to add the tones to it. that will help the image really pop and read well. There's a little bit of that green color mixed in with the blacks to make it meld nicely and to make sure that the color is uniform throughout. It's a fairly simple process. This cover especially was relatively easy to paint. The trickiness was all in the inking, because as you can see, there's pretty broad areas where I'm just sort of doing washes of, you know, the green, the really dark green, or the yellows and oranges of the candle. You can see here that I've mostly filled in the overall values for the piece. I know some artists who will do values, the light to darks first, and then paint tints of color over it, but this is just sort of the way I prefer to work. And this is sort of the basic overall color structure of the whole cover. From here, me and the art director for the cover wanted to preserve some of the bleed effect that watercolor can create. Partially to draw attention again to the fact that it's a hand-drawn and hand-painted cover, but partially because that bleed can have sort of a nice, eerie, horror, unsettling effect. So I used a small spritz bottle to try and get the colors to run. It wasn't entirely successful, and I kind of had to keep working with it to get it to do the bleed I wanted. But I'm pretty happy with how it turned out in the end. And that's the process for creating the cover. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you will enjoy the story of Deephaven. Thank you.